The second high-level meeting of antimicrobial resistance took place in the United Nations meeting in New York on 26th of September 2024 as the principal official health-focused event during the UN General Assembly High-Level Week. The intergovernmental negotiations for the declaration were co-facilitated by Malta and Barbados, and a political declaration that you can find actually 15 pages, 106 paragraphs, was produced highlighting the fact that AMR will cause even more global suffering, particularly in low and middle income countries. So, in this podcast, we will debrief a little bit and analyze the possible impact of this meeting in consequences for the future of AMR research and antimicrobial development. Therefore, the objective of this is to discuss the political implications of the UN Declaration on Antimicrobial Resistance, comment on the scientific and public health impact of this declaration, and elaborate a little bit on future antimicrobial research and development based on these recommendations. So, welcome to Editors in Conversation. This episode is brought to you by the Antimicrobial Agents and Chemotherapy Journal, which is available at asm.org/AAC. I'm your host, Cesar Arias, Editor in Chief of Antimicrobial Agents and Chemotherapy, which is published by the American Society for Microbiology. If you plan to publish in AAC, you can get up to 50% publishing fees waived in this. So it's very important to become a member of ASM and visit asm.org/membership to sign up. Don't forget to check our latest issue of AAC with really outstanding papers on mechanisms of resistance, pharmacology, antimicrobial agents, epidemiology, and clinical therapeutics based on antimicrobial research, and much more. We have several sections tailored to you, including new sections on reviews and clinical challenges. So I have the pleasure to be joined by two really leaders, thought leaders in this space of antimicrobial resistance and development. Dr. John Rex, who is the Chief Medical Officer of F2G Limited, an operating partner of Advent Life Biosciences, and he's the editor-in-chief of AMR Solutions, which is actually a very nice and amazing newsletter. So go to the webpage and sign up for this letter because John Rex keeps you updated on everything that is happening in the antimicrobial resistance and antimicrobial development research arena. Dr. Prabha Fernandez, who is a retired pharmaceutical executive. She's the chair of the World Health Organization Antibiotic Prioritization Working Group, and is retired chair of the GARD-P Scientific Advisory Committee, which is the Global Antibiotic Research and Development Partnership, and is also the retired chair of the National Biodefense Science Board. So welcome to the program. Welcome to the show. So 2 weeks ago, almost now, a very momentous meeting at the UN. So, John, we have a very diverse audience. Put us in context. Why is this important?
So, the big deal here is that it was a political event. And let me kind of deconstruct that a tiny bit. We have had lots of conversations at a technical level about the need for new antibiotics and the threat of resistance. And you can read paper after paper in Antimicrobial Agents and Chemotherapy about the rising tide of resistance. But that's us techie people talking to each other. Here, by having an event during the United Nations General Assembly, we move it up to heads of state. We move it up to ministers of health and ministers of finance. We get all the high-level decision makers talking about this, and the opportunity to have a full high-level meeting on antimicrobial resistance means that all these senior politicos who want to come and say something, as we'll discuss in a minute, there was almost 8 hours of little brief 3-minute snippets from countries around the world. Every one of those meant that somebody in that country spent time on this. And so the message about antimicrobial resistance and the need for new drugs was brought all the way up to senior political leadership. And that's the magic of this event.
That is very nicely explained. So, Dr. Fernandez, what does it mean? So, do you think that John explained, gets to the decision makers of these countries. So, in your experience, and having dealt with different countries and different situations, what will be the actual impact of this declaration? What do you think?
So, as John said, this was a very, not only political group, but a very diverse group who came together, which itself is an unusual thing, very diverse group. And they came to pass a resolution and recognized the problem, but they also came to an agreement on ways how to address it. I thought that was very, very important because this, as John said, would have been discussed at each of those countries that they were going to come to an agreement to this. So that's very key. And then, of course, there are press coverages. So there are press coverages of the UN presentation, which was made in each of the countries where the speakers came from. I saw a lot of clippings which came out from many of these countries, including in India, from where I am. And that makes an impact because those clippings had quotes from the UN meeting where they talked about how AMR affects health, how it affects your ability to get treated, even for common infections. And it talked about increased mortality. Death is so final that it really makes an impact when you write about that. And death in children has an especially big impact. So, yes, I do agree with John. This is the first time it's come to this level. And political and policy, is so important. If the countries can put in policy and put the money behind these policies, that's where it will work.
That's the main caveat, right? The political will and the financial backing of this. There was this a series of paper published in the Lancet, trying to make the point with projections now. They're very reliable scientists about how more than 30 million people can die by 2050. So, John, what is your opinion about the actual impact? And before we go to the main highlights of this, when you get to this point that you think now there is a political understanding, at least, what will be the barriers to implement this at the political level?
The barrier is going to be that it costs money. I mean, it really is as simple as that, and it also costs time and energy. So there are lots of things in the world where people want action. We want action on climate change. We want action on poverty. We want all this stuff. And so antimicrobial resistance is one of a number of activities that needs time and resource. And ultimately, you have to decide where you're going to spend your time and energy because there's only so much of that to go around. So you pointed to this notion of the cost aspect of it, and I've really come to appreciate the fact that data for change come best when you get the economists and the finance ministers thinking deeply about what it costs to do versus not do. And so there have been a series of papers, a long list actually of papers that have focused on the consequences in terms of mortality, in terms of morbidity, and you can actually turn that into dollars. There was a very recent paper that we'll put links below to this if you want to go look it up. But there's one that from the Center for Global Development that says that look, if you right now we're spending about, believe it or not, $66 billion a year globally on antimicrobial resistance related issues, and that number will go to almost 160 over the next 25 years if we just kind of don't do anything, and whereas if you put some effort into it, and actually the effort is a single digit billions of dollars, which sounds like a lot, but spread out over the globe, it's actually a reasonable amount to put in. You actually get back, for every dollar you put in, you get 28 back, ultimately in reduced costs. But it's like buying insurance. You got to be willing to buy the insurance, and it doesn't, on the day you buy the insurance, it doesn't seem to pay off, but the payoff is down the road. And that's what's hard. So data for change come from the economics.
Yeah. So, Prava, what do you think about this concept of competing interests, for, particularly in lower middle income countries that you are very familiar to, including conflict, right? That you say, well, you're going to have to invest on antimicrobial resistance, but there are people maybe starving, and I need to use the money on other things. So, what are your thoughts on this?
So I do believe a lot of communication through press coverage, getting people convinced in the communities at large is very, very important, because these are the people who interact with the politicians who then fund these programs. Local development is funded by the politicians. So communicating, getting the communities, the society to buy into what our needs are, especially when it goes to human health of their families, health of their children. That's where it counts. And I think it's exceedingly important that a ground swelling, coming up from ground up, is very, very important. And this particular UN meeting, I think, did achieve some of that. As John said, scientists have been speaking about this for years, but this is the first time it's hit the mainstream press.
Okay, great. So with that, John, give us what are the highlights of this? What would you think were important things? I mean, I know the declaration, I have it in front of me, it's 15 pages, 106 paragraphs, touching all this complexity of antimicrobial resistance, which is, unlike COVID, unlike HIV, is not one disease, is not one virus, is a multiple situation. And as I've always said, we cannot really fight this phenomenon because this is evolution, right? So every time you give an antibiotic, the microorganism is going to change. So we are looking about mitigating this. So tell us about what you think were highlights of this declaration.
So you say it's 106 paragraphs. It's got sections that cover everything from governance to diagnostics. Okay, so if I would point out a few of the paragraphs that I think are particularly interesting. So paragraphs 5 and 6 talk about what it costs right now if you don't do anything. And this is a place like it quotes the data that there were in 2019 there were almost 5 million deaths globally associated with resistant infections. There's a paragraph that's very interesting. Paragraph 24 has to do with having national action plans. One of the goals is for every country to be doing the things that that country needs to do. And to actually go back to something Prabha said a second ago, in some cases here, we're talking about clean food, clean water, and vaccination. I mean, that's the thing to do. And if you will, that's a great thing to spend money on because that's very powerful and it gets your citizens healthier out there doing healthy citizen things. So that's one of those things that it's pretty easy to make the case for doing that. And actually, it's interesting that the National Action Plan thing is tied to the year 2030. By 2030, we want to have national action plans. We want to have another high level meeting in 2029. And then in 2030, something important happens at the political level globally, which is that we not reset, but we're going to update what are called the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. This is going all the way back again to this UN is a political body. And the SDGs, of which there are 17, are the goalposts for what everybody's trying to measure in terms of improving health around life around the world. And so 2030, we're going to update the SDGs, and we want to be ready to do that with the 2029 repeat of the high level meeting. So you see how this kind of all ties together. There's a paragraph about evidence. Paragraph 30 says generate some evidence. And then there's a paragraph about diagnostics, one of our favorite things. We like to enhance the appropriate use of antibiotics is a good thing to do. And there's one about the private sector, whether there's all of us creating new antibiotics. We can talk about that, the idea of what it takes to create a new antibiotic. And then the last paragraph says we're going to come back together in 2029. I've already mentioned this. So that's really this important series of things connected to push us all in the direction of doing the right things globally.
Yeah, so it's nice to see that a body like UN has put in paper some of the things that we've all thought about for a long time. But as a physician scientist myself, and when we're involved in drug discovery and all this, Prava, what would you think will be the actual impact of this in discovering new antibiotics or new ways to at least mitigate this problem?
So for me, I always say discovery, is going to take decades. So let's not just count on new antibiotics, right? So what we want to do is first use some of the guidance which has now been set up in this declaration to preserve some of the old antibiotics by providing clean water, providing sanitation, using hygiene, hand washing, all these things. That has to be done. So you preserve the existing compounds. You use diagnostics, perhaps, proper use. You correct the selling of drugs without prescription. That has to be monitored. You cannot use drugs which are contaminated or not made properly, so they don't have the right dosage. You get resistant. So control the current antibiotics first. Then we talk about access, right? And that was very important. The access was presented there. And in GARD P, that was a high priority to provide access to some of these new antibiotics which are being approved. And this is a high priority goal for GARD P. And so the ability to manufacture locally would decrease the cost, so they have access to it. But providing access is not for free. You cannot then use it willy-nilly. One has to be able to control the use. And I was very happy to see in the UN document that in the resolution that there is going to be some effort in putting in regulations and some strict controls on the use of some of these new antibiotics. So what is new today will not remain new forever, and they should be able to use, and plus go back and use some of the old ones first. But diagnostics is very important. But until then, you'll have surveillance. Surveillance will guide the treatment with some of these new antibiotics. Is it necessary to use these new ones? And so controlling some of these are very, very important. Now, will it help new? I gave it considerable thought as to, will this document help develop new antibiotics? Well, in the West, as we all know, it's very hard to get financed to develop antibiotics. It's expensive. And so, I thought about Bugworks as an example. They developed in Bangalore. I am from Bangalore, so it made sense that, they had good research going on there. And okay, they developed a drug, and now there's interest in it by GARD P, and it's funded by Carbex and GARD P, which is great. And, we saw at the COVID times that there is a lot of pride locally on something being originated in these in middle income countries. There's a lot of pride. And so, my thought when I read this document was, if there is interest to develop antibiotics, perhaps the money we raise here in the West can be used, perhaps even with collaborations in universities abroad, to be able to discover and develop drugs in India, for instance, South Africa. I mean, there are Australia, there are plenty of countries who can do this now. They're well-defined ways. They've taken classes to be able to do this. And maybe that would be one way to be able to find new antibiotics. After all, we all know that the biggest use of these antibiotics is going to be in those countries. That's where you're seeing a lot of resistance. And it has to be used properly, but at least it can get originated there. And the big advantage for us here in the West is that, okay, you get new antibiotics, which could be used in the West if developed properly, and which meets the guidance here. And so we will also have new antibiotics, but that would be one way to be able to get new antibiotics done.
Okay, so that's very important, very thoughtful statements there. And I want to go back to this issue of access, particularly for this. But let's talk about costs again, because I think this is where, as John said, where the money is really on this. And I just want to read one of these paragraphs of this declaration. Just to put this in context, that AMR can result in about $1 trillion of additional healthcare costs per year by 2050, and 1 to 3.4 trillion of gross domestic product losses per year by 2030. And that treating drug-resistant bacterial infection could alone cost about 412 billion annually, coupled with workforce participation and productivity losses of about 443 billion. Antimicrobial resistance is predicted to cause an 11% decline in livestock in LMIC countries. This is staggering figures. What do you think, John?
Those precise numbers are one set of estimates. There are many other estimates that are numerically similar. They're all within 2 to 3-fold of each other. So, in short, the cost of antimicrobial resistance is staggering. You get your leukemia cured and you die of a stupid infection. It really, and that years of life lost and all that, you do the math on that. And so it's generating that kind of data about the relative value of doing all of the basic stuff, sanitation and vaccination, and then layering on that the use of diagnostics, and layering on that the use of the availability of adequate antibiotics. The fact that is actually a lot cheaper, and it actually builds the global economy. I think one of the more interesting ones is, what's the size of the global economy, and how much will it go up or down? And one estimate, the recent one from the Center for Global Development, says that basically 2050, if we just keep doing what we're doing, that the global economy will be about $2 trillion smaller as a consequence just of AMR. So as people lost, jobs not happening, all that sort of stuff. So it's that kind of evidence that gets people, that causes finance ministers to say, well, okay, we do need to have some action.
And I just want to ask you briefly, to you both. And as an ID doctor, I always face this problem that this antibiotic is too expensive. It's being told this drug that is saving this person's life, that is going to be too expensive. But this cancer drug, who's maybe is prolonging the life of this patient for 3-4 weeks in probably miserable conditions, we can pay for it. Okay, so why is that? Why a life-saving drug is deemed not that valuable on this? Any thoughts, any of you guys?
Well, I'll say that question gets brought up regularly, and the antibiotics have been inexpensive for a long time, and we've had good generic antibiotics that you could use, and that has gotten us used to the idea that anybody can prescribe an antibiotic, and they ought to be relatively cheap. The notion that you can come along and have an antibiotic that you should pay a great deal for, because you're going to have manufacture a limited amount, and actually, when you only make small amounts of anything, it's actually relatively expensive to do that. It really kind of it feels wrong, but yet, in fact, the truth is that course of antibiotic is going to give you back 30-40 years of life. So you could be a young person with pneumonia, or a baby dying of sepsis, and you cure that baby, and you get back an entire human lifespan. And so the idea that should only, that the drug for that would be only $5, it would be nice. It's only $5, but in fact, there are times when it's going to be more than that. So, but this, I guess I want to wind all this back and say that when we've thought a lot about how we should make antibiotics available, and a theme that has emerged is this notion that antibiotics are they're like fire extinguishers. They're used to put out a fire, use them briefly, and fire extinguishers you don't use every day, yet you do use them every day. All three of us are sitting in a room somewhere that has a fire extinguisher in it. Okay, I've got one in my kitchen. And that fire extinguisher, we've all agreed to buy it. Another version on this is, any kind of insurance, life insurance, home insurance, that sort of thing. We pay for those things every day. I pay for my life insurance. Did it pay off today? Well, no, and I'm not too upset about that. I'm willing to pay my premium for my life insurance. So all of that put together has made us realize that antibiotics are weird as drugs. They're not like any other medicinal. And that problem, this problem of wanting to have them but not use them, and Prabha said it very clearly, you want to have them, you don't want to use them, and be careful with them. And you just said it as well. We have to change the way we buy antibiotics. And that's been the focus of another parallel work stream, this notion of de-linked purchases. And we've now seen the UK, the United Kingdom, do this. The United Kingdom has agreed to buy, they did a pilot, and they actually are now buying 2 antibiotics on a fixed fee per year. They're going to pay £10 million a year for those 2 antibiotics, whether they use them or not. And that's the really important thing, whether you use them or not. And £10 million a year for each one of those is a sort of the UK-sized portion of which you have to contribute to incentivize new antibiotics. So this whole idea that we've focused on, and there's a thing called the Pasteur Act that we really want to see pass in the United States that will create a similar model for the United States, where the U.S. will spend some money to buy interesting new drugs, not all of them, but some of them, and make them available, whether we put them into a human being or not. So that's it. It really is a conundrum. And you really got to be very open about it. And it's taken us a long time to learn to talk about it in a way that seemed fair to everybody. Yes, we would like them to be. We don't want cost to be the thing that keeps you from saving the baby's life, but it does cost something to create the drug.
Indeed. Prava, any thoughts on this?
Yes, so I've also thought about this, and how do you price antibiotics right, and why do people say antibiotics are too expensive to use? Part of it, of course, is the fact that there are these DRG systems where they have a fixed amount of payment for a certain indication, and so they use this. But let's say in the case of cancer, as you just brought up, why? So in a lot of infections, the cheaper drugs work. And physicians, maybe not you, but others have been spoiled because majority of infections are treatable. And so they get treated with cheaper antibiotics. So it's always trial until it fails, and then I'll go use the expensive drug. And so they don't use the best drug possible. As the number of failures increase, that's when eyes will be open and say, maybe I should use the better one first. And I think that's the day we have to wait for, sadly. And some of those days may have come in other countries where old drugs don't work. And in countries, like in India, like in South Africa, people are reaching for the latest, greatest cephalosporin to be able to be used, or, one of the newer drugs to use, because those days will come. And it'll come here too, but it's just slower because we are more careful.
Yeah. I always remember my training, the quotation, the best antibiotic is the one that works.
Yeah.
Period.
You could pick up this theme of antibiotic stewardship, and you probably use the word control of it. I've been thinking a lot about that, and there were some interesting seminars I've been in recently where people have been discussing the notion that holding antibiotics in reserve, like the WHO has this scheme called AWARE, the access, watch, and reserve. So every antibiotic goes into one of 3 categories: access, watch, or reserve. And when you put an antibiotic on reserve, it's a good thing in that it tells people be careful with this, but it also means that no one gets any experience with it. So the docs may not even think to use it. And interestingly, the microbiology lab won't be testing it because the manufacturers will say, well, I'm not going to put it on my testing automated card until there's enough demand. And since nobody's using it, there's no demand, so it doesn't get on the card, and you see the cycle spinning around. And so I've been wondering, do we need to retitle antibiotic stewardship? Is it antibiotic facilitation? Is it antibiotic optimization? And I'd rather, and it also would get away from this notion of sort of the antibiotic police. So let's actually talk about this idea of there are times when you want to use the newer drug first because it's the one that's going to work. And it's a really interesting challenge how we communicate that with ourselves.
And we do a lot of research, and I have a lot of connection, including personal connections this year with one of my family members, which was from the community, infected with a multi-drug resistant organism that we tried to sequence immediately, that had NDM and OXA 181, and is an epidemic now going on. So I mean, there's no time to go with the sort of cheaper version. You have to give the antibiotic that actually works from the beginning, and maybe de-escalate later. So anyway, Prava, let's go back to this concept of national plans. In your experience, particularly with LMIC countries, and one part of the declaration really mentioned about that by 2030, all countries should have developed an updated and implemented multisectorial national action plan on antimicrobial resistance with national targets informed by analysis of existing capacities and priorities. Is it doable?
It's doable for some. It's doable for some, but not for all. And that's going to be the gaps which we have to be worried about filling, because the resistance will happen in the gaps. And they don't know that the other country is trying to do the right thing. So, you know, the plan, which I guess is going to be discussed this November in Saudi Arabia, they will figure out which country is able to do which part of this action plans, and who needs the money, where are the resources. All that is going to be discussed in Saudi Arabia in November. And we hope that every country has enough to at least get the basics, do the surveillance, do the hygiene, do the sanitation, get the clean water. And, they may not be able to do everything in the book, because it is overwhelming, the amount of work which needs to be done for some of these countries. Because, there are other things they have to worry about, simply as food and nutrition. And, as you're seeing in a lot of these countries now, you have wars, not just the two major ones, but in all of the countries now, nearby there are wars and trouble. And these are just festering, malnutrition. They're festering infections and wounds. And we hear about these wounds being infected with these horrible microorganisms. And of course, they need some of these new antibiotics. But it has to be given out. I've also heard that those who can afford it can right away and get the newer antibiotics, because they're willing to pay the price of, from the Western countries. Mail orders are pretty fast now, and so you can do that. But it's the middle and the low income people who cannot afford these. So we don't want resistance to happen even before the drug is made accessible. So, that's very, very important.
Okay.
And you might actually build on that and say that there's this paragraph in the middle of it, paragraph 36, that talks about raising money, providing money to the countries who don't have the funding to get started. WHO has created template national action plans, and so and there's an effort to help everybody get up to sort of the basic level of the game with a national action plan. So it's really nice to see that called out.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we'll talk about that money funding in a little bit. So one of the things that struck me is they call for this creation of this independent panel, John.
Mm-hmm.
Literally says independent panel for evidence for action against antimicrobial resistance in 2025 to facilitate the generation and use of multisectorial scientific evidence to support member states in those efforts. What are your thoughts on that? And this is like, a Star Wars sort of council that is going to guide things. So what do you think about this panel? Who is going to be in those panels, and how it's going to work?
Okay. So the independent panel on evidence is a very important activity, and we're already seeing funding being offered up to support it. We've seen, I believe the EU they said they were going to donate some money, and there are a couple other groups that have already put some money into creating this. And it's important because I'm going to go back to what we said at the very beginning. This is a political activity. You want to be able to explain to people why to politicians, to thought leaders, to people who aren't docs, okay, to folks to whom AMR is just a funny set of letters, okay, but why should I pay attention to this? And you want data from a trusted independent group to come in and say, this isn't the techies getting all excited about doing some science that nobody understands. No, this is actually really important stuff for human beings. It's really important stuff for citizens in my country. It might even be really important to me and my children that this happens. And so the independent panel, it will be a highly political, and I'm using that, I do not mean that in a negative way. It will be a highly political activity, just as the whole UN General Assembly and the high-level meeting was political. We want these folks, we want the finance ministers to trust the data that this group produces, to produce other versions of the information that you can see in these various reports, and to update it over time to show whether we're going in the right direction. So come back to this idea of the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs. Those are things we can measure over time. Well, the independent panel should be measuring over time. Is mortality going down? Are the babies doing better in the ICU, in the neonatal ICU? And do I trust the data? Well, you're going to trust it when it comes from this panel. So that's why this is such a big deal.
So a point I want to mention is, this idea that economic losses will certainly, energize these governments to do something about it. And at the meeting, when people were presenting, I heard, I think it was somebody from Kenya, who said that economic losses have finally, I think, gotten home this One Health concept, that what they're doing in agriculture, what they're doing in farming, in what they're doing in animal farming, and which then comes back to humans. So what they have done is actually built a veterinary college, an agricultural college, and a medical college all on the same campus. That was pretty impressive. This was in Kenya. I mean, I haven't seen that happening in the US. So, I was very impressed with that. And that there finally the message has gone through. And I saw that this is also happening in some parts of India, that they have realized that what they're doing in animals and plants are going to affect humans. So they're managing that because the antibiotic use there is affecting it. The other impact is to tell the community about antibiotics in food and how it causes resistance. So there's pressure from the consumer, to not buy. And you're also seeing it in middle income countries now. You're seeing it in Europe, you're seeing it in India, you're seeing it in Japan, not to have antibiotics in food. So there's pressure coming from everywhere now, and that the economic losses are going to eventually dictate that we do something about it.
Yeah. So, Pra, with that idea, tell us where the money is going to come from. Apart from obvious economies, I'm talking about economies that are weak. Are there other ways in which these initiatives could be funded in the future? I'm thinking
Yeah,
about things like malaria, HIV, which there are maybe other sources of funding that could be used for this.
so I don't believe raising money is that difficult. I've raised a lot of money in my life, and I know I could raise the money. The thing is, can you use the money correctly? Can you account for every dollar and show an impact from those dollars which were given? Because that money should not be a one-time event, right? It wants to be sustained, and you've got to be able to give back the deliverable, saying, I'm going to clean up the water, I'm going to be building these septic tanks, or whatever you're going to be doing the surveillance, showing that the AMR levels go down. I mean, that's very, very important. So that having to be able to sustain this is very important. The other thing I was thinking is, I've been at GARDP, as you know, I've been at various places, and everyone's putting money into making new antibiotics and hoping it'll get used and make money somewhere. But the infrastructure which is being proposed in this document, all of the needs, the surveillance, the ability for hygiene, for controlling the use of these antibiotics, the ability not to be able to sell without prescription, all of that is so important that this infrastructure proposed in the UN document is absolutely essential for the success of GARDP, for the success of the AMR fund, for the success of CARBEX, because all these new antibiotics will need everything proposed in this document to be able to be successful. So that's what I would tell the investors who put money into AMR fund, investors who put money into CARBEX, including the government, including the pharmaceutical companies, including individuals, high net worth individuals, and say, your infections, need to be treated. Let's get this fixed in the poorer countries.
Beautiful, excellent discussion. So let's finalize with two important topics. One you mentioned about diagnostics, and I believe there's been an explosion of technologies and all that. John, how do you envisage this is going to be used on that particular field?
Well, we actually do have the diagnostics that, in general, can guide care. They exist. There are lots of tools. The real challenge is making them available in a timely fashion to everybody around the world. And a lot of the miniaturization technologies, they're lovely. There's some really brilliant things you can do, but you've still got to make it available. And I think the biggest part of the push right now is on building laboratory infrastructure globally so that you can actually run the diagnostic test in an organized way. And also deal with this thing I mentioned earlier, which is susceptibility testing is actually what causes people to think of a drug. And you've got to have a way for that to be part of the automated panels. There's only so much real estate on the little plastic card, so you can only have so many drugs there. So there are some issues with that sort of guidance in terms of what drug to choose. But I think that we are going in the right direction by training people. And maybe that's another one of the elements that we should highlight in here. There's a call throughout the several places in the document for people who actually do this. So a diagnostic doesn't run itself. Some human being has to think to do it and then know how to do it and then know what to do with the result. And having folks trained to do that is a big part of it, and having them know how to do it in a relevant way for veterinary care and for crop care. So all of that together is where the diagnostics, the human beings have to get in there and use the tool correctly. So we actually have to or actually put people in rather than lose them from this area.
Beautiful. And Prava, how about surveillance?
So yeah,
Let's talk about surveillance. Very important type
yes,
of data.
I'd like to also pick up on the diagnostics a little bit, if you don't mind, Cesar.
Sure, sure.
Yeah, so on the diagnostics aspect, the big push now is to have a small equipment, very small equipment, which can be used at a doctor's office or an ER, and which delivers the results in an hour. And these things are happening now. These things are happening. So because the patient starts getting treated with some antibiotics or a mixture of 2 or 3 different antibiotics, and then either the patient doesn't come back, or is either, and if they're doing well, they don't change the antibiotic just because your results didn't show otherwise. So you need the results quickly. So the push is to get it quickly. And if you talk about not spending money on an expensive antibiotic, these things cost money. So of course one has to worry about cost. So the push is to get it cheap and get it small and get it fast. And these things are on the way from what I see.
Okay. So
Yeah,
let's talk about surveillance. I think that just to close this important discussion. So I think this is very important to have local data, and unfortunately we don't have it available, and things happen and we don't know about. So what are your thoughts on this and on these surveillance programs?
we worked a lot on surveillance at GARP, and we had surveillance in various areas in Africa and India, and it was interesting. The profiles were very different in different areas. And what became useful is for emergency treatment of babies and pediatric treatment, because as we all just spoke about, diagnostic results don't come out in time, so they've got to get treated immediately. And they could use the local surveillance data to treat. And I think that is very important. I believe GARP has published on some of this now. And if that can be extended throughout the world and gather that data, you will know. Plus travelers, let's say I go to a certain part of Africa or India and come back, at least you know what bugs are picked up there. So surveillance is very, very important. And there should be data exchange. There should be a common database where all of this is fed into, because we have to be aware of what's happening in other parts of the world. But it's very key. And I was very happy to hear during that one day UN meeting that some of the countries have started this. So that's very interesting.
Yeah, the
John?
whole Fleming initiative is about building up laboratories to generate data. The WHO has been running a program called GLASS, the Global Laboratory for, I'm going to get it wrong, the Global Laboratory for Antimicrobial Susceptibility Surveillance, something GLASS. It's put the link below if you have the real name of it. But it's meant to be a global database that collects information like this, so that we can all see, what's coming. So there is effort, and it's one of those things that costs money, and it doesn't seem to do anything on any given day. But as evidence for change, the knowing what the resistance rates are is really very powerful.
Yeah, I'm very hopeful that genomics will get to that point that we can actually produce surveillance in genomic surveillance of this, which is, picking up genes and all that. And there are several efforts on that. Okay,
Right.
so I want to finalize to your thoughts. Should we be optimistic now, more optimistic than before, or do you think the things are not going to change? I'm an optimist, and I am very optimistic after I read this and I listen to some of the discussions. What are your thoughts on the future?
COVID did do something good for us. We became aware that infections can happen. We know infections can spread. We know infections can become pandemics, and people worry that it affected the economy. It's all about money, right? It's economy. It affected economies. So people were aware, and surveillance of water systems, of effluents are being tested. Not just sewage, but other things in streams and stuff are being tested now, and they're being tested in many countries now. And one thing which came out good from COVID is that rapid methods to test this has come for viruses, and many countries are now looking at bacteria and resistance. And to go back to what you just said, Cesar, perhaps that's where the genomics will come in very handy, when you can actually track, which genes are going to show up where. Yeah.
Yeah. John, the last word.
So I am optimistic. We're seeing science that's really interesting, and it looks like there will be at least a few new interesting drugs. But we're also seeing a conversation at a level we've never had before. We have politicians, economists talking about this, and we even have a song and dance number or two about it. So there's a musical called Lifeline that started off as a thing at the Edinburgh Fringe in 2018, I believe, or 2019, that has now gone through several iterations, and it performed for 5 weeks leading up to the high-level meeting. And it tells the story of antimicrobial resistance in song. We have got a dancing petri dish. We've got a copy of The Lancet on stage. We've got memorable lyrics about the drugs, about using drugs in food ag, and then they get into create resistance. So there's a bit about the drugs are in the ground, the drugs are in the water, the drugs are in the ground. And it's this very emotional song about the resistance developing. And that's the kind of communication. You don't have to be a scientist to understand it, because you know a little bit from COVID, and then you hear this stuff and you go, oh, I kind of get it. So I think that being able to communicate this stuff in non-techie terms, which is what we did. Think about it. The Barbados and Malta spent a year putting together this political declaration, get everybody to agree to it. Everybody turned up to give every country's representative turned up to give their short, I want to do this too, which meant they had to figure out what that meant to say that. Wow. That's from 2002, 3, 4, when IDSA published the Bad Bugs, No Drugs monograph. It was just us techie people talking to each other. To 20 years later, we have got the world talking about this. Huge, huge.
Okay. Well, with those thoughts and optimistic thoughts, we are going to conclude. This is a fascinating conversation. Thank you very much to help us understand this high-level UN meeting, which I'm sure is going to have tremendous consequences for all of us in this field. Thank you very much to both. This is Cesar Arias, Editor-in-Chief of AAC, signing off.